If you came here to understand how a small river settlement became the city that shaped revolutions, defined art, crowned emperors, and survived occupation, you're in the right place. Over the next few minutes, you're going to watch Paris rise, fall, burn, rebuild, and reinvent itself again and again without skipping the blood, the brilliance, or the stubborn spirit that refuses to let this city disappear. From a cluster of wooden huts in the middle of a river to the glittering skyline we recognize today, this is the entire story of Paris told in the same rhythm history lived it. Long before it was called Paris, before cathedrals and cafes and couture, there was only an island in the Seine. Around 259 BC, a Celtic tribe known as the Parisii settled on what we now call the Isle de la Cite. They were river people fishermen, traders, craftsmen who understood the value of controlling a crossing point. The river was their highway, their defense, and their lifeline. The name, Parisii, likely meant something like boat people or craftsmen, and that tells you almost everything about their world. They weren't dreaming of empires. They were surviving. Then in 52 BC, survival became war. Julius Caesar and his Roman legions arrived during the Gallic Wars. The Parisii resisted. The settlement was burned in the fighting, reduced to ash in the face of Roman expansion. But Rome did what Rome always did. It rebuilt. The new settlement was named Lutetia, often translated as marshy place. Not exactly poetic, but practical. Roman Lutetia grew primarily on the left bank. Straight roads cut through the landscape. Bathhouses steamed. Temples rose. An amphitheater capable of holding around 15,000 spectators hosted games and spectacles. Aqueducts carried water. For 3 centuries, it was a functioning Roman town, modest by imperial standards but stable. Empires, however, are mortal. By the 3rd century, Germanic tribes were pressing in from the north. Raids intensified. The residents of Lutetia retreated back to the defensible island at the center of the river. Walls were reinforced. The Roman order that once seemed eternal began to crack. Lutetia was changing, and so was the world around it. The 5th century brought chaos. The Western Roman Empire was collapsing under the weight of internal decay and external invasion. In 451 AD, Attila the Hun marched westward, his forces sweeping across Europe. As he approached the city, panic spread. Many wanted to flee. According to tradition, a young woman named Genevieve urged the people to stay, to pray, to hold their ground. Whether through faith or fortune, Attila's army diverted course. The city was spared. Genevieve would later become Saint Genevieve, patron saint of Paris, and in that moment of terror she gave the city something it desperately needed, belief in its own survival. In 508 AD, Clovis I, king of the Franks, made Paris his capital. This was a turning point. The city took its name from the ancient Parisii tribe, reclaiming its pre-Roman identity even as it stepped into a new era. Clovis converted to Christianity, aligning his rule with the church. Paris began to grow not just as a political center, but as a spiritual one. Churches multiplied. The city was no longer merely a Roman remnant. It was becoming distinctly French. But danger returned by river once more. Beginning in 845 AD, Viking raiders sailed up the Seine, targeting Paris repeatedly. They wanted silver, not land. In one early raid, the city paid them off with thousands of pounds of silver to make them leave. It was survival by ransom. The most devastating siege came in 885 AD. For months, a small force of defenders held fortified bridges against a vastly larger Viking army. They endured hunger and exhaustion until reinforcements finally arrived. Paris survived again, but the lesson was clear. Survival required strength. Walls were thickened. Defenses improved. By the year 1000, Paris was still compact, centered largely on the island, but it was expanding outward. Markets spread along both banks of the Seine. Trade intensified. The city was becoming a crossroads where commerce, religion, and royal authority converged. The stage was being set for a transformation that would define it for centuries. The 12th and 13th centuries marked Paris's rise to undeniable prominence. In 1163, construction began on Notre Dame Cathedral. It would take nearly 2 centuries to complete. Gothic architecture was pushing the limits of engineering, and Notre Dame embodied that ambition. Flying buttresses, vast rose windows, soaring vaults, it was stone reaching toward heaven. The cathedral wasn't just a religious building. It was a declaration. Paris was announcing itself. At the same time, the University of Paris emerged as one of Europe's intellectual powerhouses. By the early 1200s, scholars from across the continent gathered on the left bank. Theology, philosophy, law ideas flowed through lecture halls and cloisters. Latin dominated academic life, giving the area its enduring name, the Latin Quarter. Medieval Europe was learning how to reason, argue, and question within these streets. King Philip II, who reigned from 1180 to 1223, reshaped the city physically. He ordered streets paved that had once been muddy tracks. He constructed the Louvre not as a museum, but as a fortress guarding the western edge of the city. Thick walls, a defensive tower, a moat. Paris would not be easily sacked again. By 1300, the population approached 200,000, making it one of Europe's largest cities. Bridges multiplied. Guilds regulated trades. The city thrived. Then the 14th century brought devastation. In the 1310s, famine swept across Europe. Harvests failed. Starvation followed. In 1337, the 100 Years' War erupted between England and France, dragging Paris into a long, grinding conflict. And in 1348, the Black Death arrived. The plague tore through the city, killing perhaps a third to half of its inhabitants. Corpses overwhelmed burial grounds. Entire neighborhoods emptied. Trade faltered. If you lived in Paris during those years, you witnessed a world unraveling. Social unrest followed. In 1358, peasants revolted in the Jacquerie. In 1382, the Malotins uprising saw Parisians rebel against crushing taxes. Anger simmered. In 1420, during the 100 Years' War, Paris fell to English and Burgundian forces. For 16 years, the city lived under foreign occupation. Then, in 1429, a teenage girl from Lorraine altered the course of the war. Joan of Arc claimed divine guidance and persuaded the Dauphin to entrust her with an army. Her victories, particularly at Orleans, shifted momentum. Though her attempt to reclaim Paris failed and she was wounded, her presence electrified France. The Dauphin was crowned Charles VII. Joan was captured, tried for heresy, and burned at the stake in 1431. She was 19, yet her legacy endured. Paris was liberated in 1436. By 1453, the war ended. The city, scarred and exhausted, began to rebuild. The 16th century brought Renaissance splendor and religious horror. Francis I embraced Italian art and architecture, transforming parts of the Louvre into a Renaissance palace. He invited Leonardo da Vinci to France. Humanism flourished. Paris grew elegant. But religious tensions between Catholics and Protestant Huguenots exploded. On August 24, 1572, the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre erupted. What began as targeted assassinations spiraled into citywide slaughter. Protestant men, women, and children were hunted through the streets. Thousands died in Paris alone, their bodies thrown into the Seine. Violence spread nationwide. It was one of the darkest chapters in French history. In 1589, King Henry III was assassinated. Henry IV, a Protestant who converted to Catholicism to secure his rule, entered Paris in 1594. He famously remarked that Paris was worth a mass. He sought reconciliation. He commissioned the Pont Neuf, completed in the early 17th century, and developed the Place des Vosges, one of the city's first planned squares. Slowly, Paris steadied itself. The 17th century cemented its grandeur. Under Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu, power centralized. The Académie Française was founded in 1635 to regulate the French language. Culture became statecraft. Louis XIV, the Sun King, elevated monarchy into spectacle. Though he moved his court to Versailles in 1682, wary of Parisian unrest, he continued reshaping the capital. Boulevards expanded. Les Invalides was constructed for veterans. Even without the king's daily presence, Paris flourished intellectually. Salons buzzed with debate. Fashion and cuisine evolved. By century's end, Paris was Europe's cultural reference point. The 18th century opened with Enlightenment brilliance. Philosophers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Diderot debated authority, reason, and rights in cafes and salons. The encyclopedia attempted to gather all human knowledge. Yet beneath intellectual vibrancy lay poverty. By the 1780s, cemeteries overflowed, prompting the transfer of millions of remains into underground quarries, the catacombs, walls lined with bones from 6 million Parisians. France teetered on bankruptcy. Bread prices soared. On July 14, 1789, Parisians stormed the Bastille. The French Revolution had begun. The monarchy was dragged from Versailles to Paris. In 1793, Louis XVI was executed. Months later, Marie Antoinette followed. The Reign of Terror consumed thousands, including its own architects. Streets that once hosted philosophical debate now echoed with the thud of the guillotine. Stability emerged under Napoleon Bonaparte. Seizing power in 1799, he crowned himself emperor and made Paris the heart of an empire. He commissioned the Arc de Triomphe and reformed law with the Napoleonic Code. The Louvre became a public museum filled with treasures seized across Europe. But after catastrophic military defeats, foreign armies occupied Paris in 1814. Napoleon was exiled, returned briefly, then fell permanently after Waterloo. The 19th century was restless. Revolutions erupted in 1830 and 1848. Barricades became symbols of Parisian defiance. Louis Napoleon Bonaparte rose to power. Declaring himself Emperor Napoleon III, he appointed Baron Haussmann to redesign Paris. Medieval alleys were replaced with grand boulevards. Parks, sewers, and uniform facades defined a new aesthetic. The changes modernized the city and made uprisings harder. Defeat in the Franco-Prussian War of 1870 led to siege and starvation. After surrender, the Paris Commune of 1871 briefly seized control. The government crushed it in the Bloody Week, killing thousands. Trauma lingered. Then came the Belle Epoque. From the 1870s to 1914, Paris glittered. Impressionists painted light. The Moulin Rouge dazzled. The Eiffel Tower rose in 1889, initially mocked, later adored. The metro opened in 1900. Paris pulsed with creativity. World War I threatened it, but the city endured. In the 1920s, jazz and expatriate writers filled cafes. Fashion houses redefined style. Yet the 1930s darkened with economic crisis and rising fascism. In 1940, Nazi Germany occupied Paris. Jewish citizens were deported. Resistance simmered. In August 1944, Parisians rose up. Allied forces entered. Liberation came with reckoning. Post-war Paris became a center of existential thought. Reconstruction reshaped suburbs. Fashion revived. In May 1968, students and workers flooded streets in protest, challenging authority. Late 20th century projects, the Louvre Pyramid, Opera Bastille, Grande Arch reimagined the skyline. The 21st century brought unrest in suburbs, terrorist attacks in 2015, and the 2019 fire at Notre Dame. Yet restoration began almost immediately. In 2024, Paris hosted the Summer Olympics, presenting itself once more to the world. Today, Paris stands layered with centuries. Conquered, burned, rebuilt, argued over, adored, it persists. From Celtic fishermen to revolutionaries, from emperors to students behind barricades, Paris has never stopped reshaping itself. Its history is not gentle. It is fierce, contradictory, luminous, and dark. But through every siege, plague, revolution, and occupation, one truth remains: Paris endures.